Hello, I'm Penelope Hobhouse, and I'm here at Mottisfont, which is my new garden. And it's quite small, so I've really decided to grow roses only in a few different ways. I use them very much as climbers because I get these vertical accents without taking up too much space. I like them as shrubs, and I like using other plants with them. This is Rosa complicata, but I'm not growing it alone. I've got clematis coming up as well. I've got catmint underneath. It's what we call companion planting. And that really works for all these different sorts of roses. And the point about roses is you can treat them as shrubs, climbers, and grow them as hedges. You don't have to grow them massed in beds all by themselves. You can see the different ways roses can be grown in the walled garden at Mottisfont Abbey in Hampshire. Graham Stuart Thomas, one of the world's most renowned rosarians, was instrumental in building up a collection of old roses. Roses which were in danger of disappearing as more modern repeat flowering types became fashionable during this century. Well, here we are at Mottisfont Abbey, and I'm with Patrick Taylor, who is a garden writer and a historian and has written about roses, mainly the old ones really, Patrick, yes, isn't that right? Yes. Mottisfont Abbey, it's famous really for two things. One, that it's nearly all old roses that grow here, and also it's roses grown with other plants. And Patrick, most of these old roses, what we call old roses, are really pale, white, pink mauves. They don't have the harsh sort of oranges and
as Graham Thomas said, all the old roses in the pinks, they have this touch of blue, whereas modern roses have a sort of yellow colour. The marvellous thing at Mottisfont is that although it's a wonderful collection of roses, almost a museum of the old roses, but for the ordinary garden visitor, the lovely thing is that you can see roses really beautifully used in a garden context.
And of course Mottisfont is a completely walled garden, and the great thing is too that the old apple trees are still here for these roses to climb up, and they love that.
And look there, you'll get a little glimpse of the countryside outside the garden. That gives a sort of breathing space, doesn't it?
Yes, and yet we're in an enclosed paradise here, completely remote from the countryside, but we know it's there. And then we haven't talked at all about the scent. And this seems to be a rose, which is really, I mean, we got a little, did you get this whiff as we walked by?
Absolutely, yes.
And it's so beautiful with its wonderful clusters.
Yes,
actually, what is this
Madame
one called?
D'Arblay.
It's beautiful, I don't know it at all.
It comes from the 1830s and is most beautiful rambler.
One of the things about these roses, Patrick, we ought to come clean about is that they really do, most of them, only flower once, even though they're with companion planting, which flowers at other seasons. Isn't that right?
Indeed. But on the other hand, they provide such a spectacular sight in late June. And in many ways, it's lovely having a flower in its season. It might get rather tedious if you had a wonderful flower throughout the year.
And what is this wonderful rose? What is this rose, Patrick?
This is Constant Spry. It's one of the earliest David Austin roses. It dates from the 1960s. It's a fabulous rose. Although here it's trained as a climber, it's actually a bush rose, but it makes very lanky growth.
It looks so lovely. Mottisfont is not only a collection of roses and other plants, but it's very carefully planned architecturally.
It really is, isn't it? Those iris yews in the middle have such a strong structural character.
Now look at this wonderful view down there with the fountain
in the middle. Yes.
It's so beautiful, this garden, because in spite of all the colour, because they're gentle colours, it's very peaceful, don't you think so?
That's true. And also the box hedges make this lovely crisp line among the profusion of the roses and other plants.
I think all gardening is getting a mood right for association. And Patrick, I keep noticing that although we say it's only one season for these roses, a lot of the ramblers are still in bud. So it's going to go on for another few weeks.
That is true.
At least,
you do get a lot of them that flower later in the season. What I like here is the height given by these old apple trees, and also these arches over the paths.
Very nice and rustic, not too smart, not too grand.
Quite.
They're really so beautiful. Now we have this great run of the campanula. Well, it really is a wonderful garden. Of course, I love the sort of containment of a walled garden, don't you? And I think it makes you feel much warmer, and you feel safe.
Yes.
And you're keeping the fragrance all in as well, I think.
One of the things I keep noticing is the marvellous trees, actually, that form the skyline here, which give more protection to the garden.
And so often in gardens you can use a sort of borrowed landscape of trees, can't you? Patrick, this is a very old rose, isn't it? This beautiful striped
Yes,
rose.
Rosa mundi.
I really love it.
Well, this must be one of the oldest garden varieties of rose in existence. It's extremely ancient, and it was used.
I really love it.
It has a wonderful
So
scent.
beautiful.
It is. It does have the problem that it is rather floppy. It is a bit lax in growth, and if you can plant it surrounded by other plants that give it a bit of support.
Of course, these are old pinks as well, aren't they? And some of the scent we're getting is probably from them.
It's intermingled, isn't it? Yes.
And that, I think they're a perfect combination.
Yes, they're very
That's
simple.
probably the way they were grown in the Middle Ages even.
Quite
don't you
possibly.
think so?
Almost sort of
'Cause
cottage
all
garden
these,
combination.
yes, and all these plants are really old plants. This is another striped one, but not quite so vivid, a little bit more
No,
muted.
sort of delicate, just splashed,
Yes.
as though with a paintbrush.
And then as a contrast, we've got white rose.
Madame Hardy, an
And
old
it
damask,
has
isn't
this
that
beautiful
extraordinarily?
green centre.
Yes. But
Yeah,
it's the
makes-
subtlety of the colours of the old roses that is really striking. You never get an absolutely flat colour.
You want something that blends in. This rose is Alba Maxima, is that what you
Yes,
said?
that's the Jacobite rose. It's one of those really valuable old roses because it has marvellous shape, it has a structure, it stands bold and upright in the middle of a border.
And beautiful foliage.
And wonderful foliage, that sort of slightly
Beautiful
glaucous
foliage.
grey
So really
foliage.
these roses have a lot more to them than just rose flower, don't they?
They do. Some of them do have this marvellous shape and they have real presence in a border.
Patrick, we're coming now right into the centre, focal point really of this garden, and we get views in every direction.
One of the things I notice when I come to Mottisfont is you enter through that green gate, and the first thing you see, the first thing that occurs to you is not, oh look, it's a wonderful rose garden. The first impression is it's a wonderful garden. It looks beautifully designed.
And that's what I think you and I both like about it really, is that although it's full of roses, it's plant association and structure and the use of space that really works. Thank you, Patrick. I think these old rose types are once again a great gardening inspiration. Through the influence of Graham and other passionate rose lovers, these old varieties have been saved for posterity. By the beginning of the 20th century, people were looking for a different sort of rose from the beautiful old-fashioned graceful flowers which only flowered once. They wanted very much to have roses of a uniform height and very definitely not only repeat flowering but would flower right through the summer. And they wanted to use them for decorating beds, very much in the same way that people grew herbs in a Tudor knot garden and the Victorians grew extravagant bedding out schemes in the 19th century. That's what they wanted to do with roses. And there really wasn't any room for the old, wonderful rose in the cottage gardens. However, by the 20s and 30s, and certainly after the last war, a few people started searching out for the old roses, some of which had really disappeared, and a few other people started breeding with them. And this introduced the modern shrub rose, many of which are really very successful, do some repeat flowering, still have the graceful form, and above all have fragrance and these beautiful muddled cabbage-like centers, which I love so much. David Austin is one of the most important breeders of this century, and actually we're going to visit his plant breeding nursery in the central England.
I had the idea of crossing old roses with modern roses to keep the old rose shape and the old rose fragrance and as far as possible the old rose growth. So we've got a nice shapely shrub. There's a certain look about an old rose, has this delicacy. I think it has to do with the fact the petals, the light goes through them this way and that, and you get all sorts of variations in light. And they're always changing. They start like that, they're gradually opening up. So you're always getting a different look. I mean, no flower varies so much as a rose. And no flower is more difficult to photograph, and no flower is more difficult to paint, actually. I did various crosses. The result of the cross was Constant Spry. Soon afterwards got another one, a red one, called Chianti, which was not so well known. Both of these roses did not repeat flower. We hadn't arrived at what we wanted, but we had at least arrived at a new old rose. What I had to do was to back cross to the repeat flowering rose. And look for a repeat flowering seedling. Well, generally when you do that, you hardly ever get a repeat flowering rose first time. This was one of our very first varieties, the Wife of Bath. We named them after Chaucer characters, which you can see has something in common with Constance Spry, but it did repeat flower, and it repeat flowered very well, you know. Got a nice scent. The real breakthrough came with the introduction of Graham Thomas, a yellow rose, and Mary Rose, a pink rose. They were both introduced in the same year at Chelsea. So everybody who came to Chelsea wanted to see these two roses, and this really made English roses better known. My whole purpose in these roses is not to have a standardized bloom, which really a hybrid tea is a standardized bloom, but to have a whole range of shapes, as well as a whole range of different growths, but preferably graceful growth, perhaps arching, perhaps bushy, perhaps upright. They all have their uses in the garden.
John Scarman only grows old roses, but of course he grows them with other companion plants, perennials and clematis growing up through them. He also is a nurseryman and a designer, specializing in old roses, loving their exuberance, their diverse blooms and their graceful habits.
Here I am beside this wonderful old mill pond. Oak trees, aspens, willows giving it shade and providing a wonderful setting for these roses. And they're growing probably just like the original roses did in natural places. This is Rosa Paulii. This is one of the earliest species, Rosa Paulii. And around the pond we also have the Holy Rose of Abyssinia, Rosa Ricardii. It's a fascinating old rose. Actually, remnants of it were found in Egyptian tombs. And over on the far side, we've got Paul's Himalayan musk, tumbling its way beautifully down a bank, itself bred from the Nepalese musk. And this surely must be exactly as the roses would have been in a natural setting several thousand years ago. And this sort of setting is just enchantment for roses. They require no spraying, they require no pruning, and they just luxuriate under these conditions. And here we can see Rosa Brunei, the Nepalese musk, growing magnificently up a tree. But of course, it's not just the wild garden that these wonderful ramblers are used for. This is the formal garden at Lower Hall Worfield. And it's a charming garden. One of the things I particularly like in this garden is the use of this rambler, Adelaide d'Orléans, with these wonderful pink buds and this really beautiful soft habit and a delicate primrose perfume. The rose comes from about 1810, but it's the whole feel and the whole attitude of the rose which really makes it so special here. And rambling roses just give that wonderful effect. Climbers would be very much more formal, very much more architectural. The use of these sort of ramblers was exactly what the English garden designers of the 1920s wanted to achieve. They wanted to have these very formal, geometric gardens and then almost destroy them with this wonderful, untidy, romantic sort of cottage planting. And I think this, is really the essence of, in many ways, an English garden. And there's some other lovely ramblers here. This is Rambling Rector, growing through a pear tree. There's a sympathetic magic about these sort of roses in fruit trees anyway. It's one of the absolutely indispensable roses in any garden. It's got the most magical perfume. It's musk rose, and it's very popular with the bees. Part of the problem with ramblers is they produce this sort of growth with its very soft shoots, no flowers on it, and it tends to obscure the planting. There's nowhere for you to actually train it or put it in. So rather than leave it in the way, what we simply do is just cut it off. And then all the energy goes into these flowers and they're not obscured by the shoot at all. This is a lovely old damask rose, Celsiana, and the same principles of pruning apply here as they did to the Rambling Rector. And we've taken off all the vegetative growth, so that all the energy of the rose just goes into those flowers. And you can also seal the flowers, which would otherwise be obscured by the growth.
Old roses have many different habits of growth. There can be ramblers with 30-foot canes, or shrubs which have a graceful arching habit, or just fan from the base. However, thanks to their pliable stems, many can be trained to achieve a great variety of effects.
This is Cerise Bouquet. It's a modern shrub rose, and like a lot of these shrub roses, it's got these wonderful, long, pliable stems. And here it's been wrapped around a tripod. And it's really very effective because these flowers are held out on nice, long, wiry stems. You can see the same sort of thing with Rosa complicata. This is grown here on a wall. I know Penelope grows it over an arch. It's ironic it should have a name like complicata because nothing could really be more simple than these wonderful, soft, pink flowers. And it's followed by delightful hips in the autumn. But really, any shrub rose that grows to about 5 foot or so, freestanding, will grow to at least 8 or 10 foot against a wall. One of the lovely things about using these old shrub roses like Cerise Bouquet are the plant associations you can have with it. And here, this wonderful pink for the robinia just combines perfectly with the lighter colouring and texture in there. And it's the reverse of the petals, which is so charming against the pink of the robinia. Often with plant associations, it's just the lightest touch that you need to bring things together. Here, we've got the old garden carnation, or pink, sops in wine, grown with the Gallica cameo, and the two just complement and match each other perfectly. This is a delightful plant association. It's a euonymus, and it's grown with the rose Bantry Bay. And one of the nice things about it is that in the young flower of the rose, you can probably see the stamens there, are yellow, and this tends to reflect in the yellow colour of the foliage. It's really very simple because with this it's both artistic and practical combined. From an artistic point of view, the euonymus, which is there of course during the winter as well, it's evergreen, that tends to hide the bare stems of the rose at the bottom. It's also got a very practical purpose because it tends to cool the rose down during very hot weather. And it's really such an attractive thing to try and link together the different textures and the different feels that you get. And this, of course, is the great delight with the older roses, that they just lend themselves with their sort of soft shapes and their really nice pastel colours to this style of gardening.
These are some of the roses I want to show you, and I'm going to start with a really vicious rose called Albertine. She's a Witturiana rose, dates to 1921, and she's got thorns that I can tell you are absolutely agony if you're trying to prune her. She's a rambler, and ramblers are all pruned immediately after flowering. Then we have Rambling Rector, and this is quite an old rose. It's a rose that people like Gertrude Jekyll and William Robinson were using at the turn of the century. And I think it's the rose that John Scarman showed you how to prune. This is Blush Noisette, a rose which is hardly a climber, but I'm actually using it on a rose arch. And it's an old rose, and it was bred in America, outside Charleston in South Carolina in 1826. Roxburghii is another favorite of mine, and these were cuttings I brought back from Italy. It's a rose that likes a hot climate, and I've seen it growing in the southern states like Louisiana. It really looks wonderful. This is the double form. It's known as the chestnut rose. It's an original species. There's no breeding there. And I'm going to finish with a rose which really is one of my great favorites. I fell in love with her a few years ago when I saw her growing at Mottisfont. It's quite modern in that it was introduced in 1896, and it has a sort of bush habit, but it's very graceful and beautiful, and these are the sort of flowers I love. It's not too much of a hybrid tea, and yet it lasts very well in the rain, and this rose goes on flowering practically the whole summer. It's called Irene Watts. Well, these are some of the roses that I love to grow in my garden, And the great thing about them is that they have such diverse habits that you can use them in many different ways to make your garden really as beautiful as possible. Goodbye. I hope to see you next time. I'm Penelope Hobhouse, and I'm in my small garden at Mottisfont. And actually it is quite a small garden. It's only 120 feet by 120, and it's completely walled round, and there's lots of planting, very thick planting on all the walls, really curtaining the walls with foliage and flower colour. And I've divided it up into compartments on different levels. I've just come down some steps, and here we have a yew hedge. And there's quite a lot of small box hedging around too, which helps divide it up into these very definite green rooms, which makes the garden certainly seem very much larger. In any garden, but particularly in a small one like this, you can use verticals to fill some of the space. You're really filling cubic space. It's like standing in a room and filling the whole room. It's a volume. Here I used globe locusts to do this, but I also, in the gravel garden, use these tall verbascums, which exactly the same way introduce the vertical element, not only the horizontal. The other thing I've done here is use gravel as a sort of linking ground cover through all these beds. That makes the garden look larger. You'll also see that I use a lot of very large-leaved plants, large thistles, large verbascums, and I put most of my annuals also in very big pots. I always think big pots look much more sensible than small ones in a small garden. In a small garden, it's even more important to simplify than in a larger space. And by simplify, I mean doing a few things well, rather than a lot of things rather less well. And that only tends to be very fussy too. The other thing you can do is try and stick to one peak period of flowering. And that's what I've really done in this garden. I made this gravel garden really this spring. Simplicity and repetition of colours are probably very important because they really hold the whole garden together. I hope it works here. Now we're going to go to Wollerton in Shropshire, and we're going to look at a garden which is actually quite large, but it's arranged in a series of small different compartments. John and Leslie Jenkins at Wollerton Old Hall have created a series of garden compartments inside a much larger garden. Some compartments are quiet green rooms, others are colour-themed. All are almost self-contained. The journey through the garden leads one on a progress of clearly defined schemes, each of which could be a single garden attached to a house. I've got with me Stephen Anderton, who's the gardening correspondent to the London Times, as well as a gardens advisor to English Heritage. And we're standing in a very small garden enclosed by hedges. What do you think the most important thing, Stephen, is about small gardens? Should they be kept as simple as possible?
Well, I certainly think if you're going to get the most out of them, then you want to use few materials and make them go a long way.
And this is what the Jenkinses have done.
They've maximised the space and kept the planting really quite simple.
It's extremely full and luxuriant, isn't it?
And I think it will be all season.
Which is lovely, and of course these plants that spill out over the path add to this feeling of profusion without making it feel smaller, isn't that right?
Well, and look how much little space there is left to walk on, but it doesn't matter. It's full, and the interest is in the planting.
I think one of the lessons, do you think one of the lessons is not to use very small plants or small groups in a small garden, which I think is a mistake people sometimes make? Do you think that's true?
You can get away with a bit of that, yes, but you need enough of the really big groups.
Yes.
Like trees on a smaller scale, you know.
I'm sure that's right, and I think that people tend to think that they must keep everything rather flat if they have a small space.
But if you have everything flat, you don't get any movement.
No, that's very interesting.
Tall things can
yes.
move, and in a small space, like today, with the feeling of the wind coming in, is worth an awful lot.
That's really true, and here we have these sort of stabilising walls and hedges and the low box, and yet we have these flowing plants with all this great sense of movement. I think it's really a very, very nice way to garden.
It is, and if this were all you had, you could have as much work as you wanted in a small area like this. I like it formal.
And
Dealing
using
with the
these
detail of
gateway
these
plants as Irish yews. This is a very compartmental garden, isn't it? It's all laid out with straight lines and right angles and turned into a series, really, of garden rooms, very much like the famous Hidcote, Sissinghurst,
Yes.
Tintinhull themes. And that means, of course, you can grow different colour themes or plant schemes in each area.
Well,
I think...
And everything can be changeable. I mean, yes, okay, they've put in a pittosporum here, and it may not be so hardy in our climate here.
Well, it looks
Cold
pretty
Midlands,
good,
it is,
doesn't
but
it?
one year it won't
Looks
be.
wonderful.
And it's not the end of the world, you know. I
No.
mean, it's a tight space. You can put in something else
And then they
special
have this
and big
nice
and ring the
akebia,
changes.
too, with lovely scented flowers in spring.
I think in a small space like this, you've got to
And
prepare,
I love
prepared for
this
things to be
graceful
dispensable.
grass, don't you?
Yes.
And hostas lurking in the shade,
See, look
just
at those
glowing.
moving. It's
Isn't that
wonderful.
nice? It's
and
beautiful.
that not. I mean, that's nice to look at all winter, big solid
Yes.
evergreen, and it's wonderful, but it's the contrast.
It's the contrast, that's right. I think that I've never used to use grasses enough, and I'm coming round to them more and more because of this graceful movement and the sound of rustling,
Yes.
which I love.
You run the risk of them being conspicuously modernist, don't you? Slightly.
Yes.
Not that it matters.
No, I
but,
mean, I'm rather
it's
keen on
always
trying to
there.
be a little bit more
Yes,
modernist
yeah.
and less traditional. And this has got a very strong colour theme, hasn't it, of reds and yellows.
Hot colours, it's good. And big, strong foliages too. It's
And
exciting.
That's a little bit like the cottage garden at Sissinghurst, isn't it? They use very much this colour. I don't think they were using quite so many big foliage plants.
But with these strong foliages, you get the even greater contrast with the simplicity of paving like this. And you get the beauty of things close up, which is what you've got to make most of in a small garden.
And this again could be a garden that belongs completely to a house, isn't that
yes,
right?
This could be it.
Could be. I'd be very happy, wouldn't you?
You'd have the front door there, you come down
Yes.
this centre path.
Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, it really is completely true that it could be a complete garden. And that's the great lesson to people of not trying to have too many different themes, too many
Yeah.
different colours, too many features like rock gardens or
There's all the
ponds.
difference in the world between variation and variety, and if you can work on variation, using things slightly differently and in different ways, I mean, like the paving
Well, I love that
throughout
cobbles,
this garden,
don't
yeah.
you?
I mean, you're going to look at that all winter, you might as well have some interest and some detailed thought into the paving, and that just forcing you either way is lovely. Breaks it up. You go ahead. Through the front door.
Through the front door into the white garden, another compartment of this
Okay.
garden. And it's divided again into a lot of small flower beds, all right angles, straight lines, enclosed by walls. This is almost entirely enclosed by walls, isn't it?
Good use of box hedging. And they've used this throughout the garden to great effect. Great strength, and it allows you to, here and there, do a lot of really small scale cottagey planting without it looking bitty.
Why do you think so many people are frightened of using box hedging, and they think it means formality,
Oh,
which is a
goodness
sort of
knows.
word that
Goodness
terrifies
knows.
them?
Well, I think also it suffers from from being lumped with all the Victorian laurels and that lingered in gardens in the 20s and 30s, and people felt were tired and old. And box came from a generation of gardening earlier than that, didn't it? It was
Yes,
used in
I
all those
suppose it
precise,
did.
delicate things.
But I love it, and I actually love the smell as well. And I actually rather love clipping it. I love the whole
Yes.
sort of process and how you get the different colours as they come again. It's true.
And there's so many
It's so
forms
nice.
of it too.
I
mean,
know
the
that. I don't
colours and
think people
textures.
realise how many forms there are.
20-something, isn't it? It's
Yes.
that sort of number. It's
Something
enormous.
like that.
Oh,
I
look at
love
this one
them
being
too.
grown
Isn't that
on its
nice? It's
stick.
being trained. And then we arrive at this wonderful whiteness of the cranberry cordifolia and the glyceria, and this is Campanula persicifolia probably. What a beautiful combination of just greens and whites. And our old friend Miss Wilmot's ghost has just been
Vicious
allowed to
as ever.
seed
It's good.
where it likes, and it's looking particularly good just now because after it's flowered the leaves go much greener, don't they?
Yes.
There's even a teasel appearing just behind.
And it will go on right through to the end of the season. If you stake it well, it turns to ivory and it stays this wonderful soft ivory colour right through to September.
And
Marvellous.
it looks so wonderful with the sun shining on it. We've just got the evening light, of course,
Yes,
too, which
yes.
is wonderful.
It's good.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much. It's been lovely
Pleasure.
going round with you, and I think we have talked quite a lot about how you can use plants in small spaces, don't you? I hope that it's been helpful, because I think these small intimate gardens are something that I find very satisfactory, because I like the feeling of enclosure and feel I'm in my own separate paradise. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
The urban gardener often has a very small patch of land, not only small but often an awkward shape, long and thin rather than wide and more comfortable. But even these small spaces can be transformed into rejuvenating environments. They really become a retreat from city life, from the cement jungle. Jim Van Sweden, who is one of the best known of American garden architects, has made a very small garden indeed in the heart of Washington. This is the garden of Barbara Bowling Woodward.
It's very small, only 17 feet wide and 85 feet deep. And of course that brings certain problems for the designer. You want to plant out the fences, you want to create mystery, you don't want to see everything at once, and you want to exploit whatever borrowed scenery is existing in the neighboring gardens in order to give a feeling of much more expansive space. Let me show you as we walk through how this works. We have a very gentle serpentine path which is flanked by plants, and you can see trees placed so they divide up the space, modulate the space, and create that mystery. You'll notice that there are some fences showing at this time of year, and about a third of the way down the path I have designed a fountain which creates a nice sculptural element giving interest at this point in the garden. It's carved as a kind of millstone with a pinwheel top, water coming out, bubbling out of the center, and it falls over this edge down into the reservoir, which is obscured by the placement of river stones. The nice thing that happened here, a wonderful element of surprise, is that the algae formed at these points where the water falls over and created those wonderful triangles, dark triangles, giving a special dimension to the design. Barbara and I have traveled in Japan together 3 times, and we love Japanese gardens, and we wanted to get the feeling of Japan in this garden. Of course, we didn't want to create a real Japanese garden, but we did want to give some of the feeling of a Japanese design, and so we used this dry stream approach, and as we got toward the house, I actually cut in a kind of pool of stone into the terrace of the house, which then ended the stream. And if you look at the garden now, you'll notice that no fences show, and it's amazing how you can live in the center of a city of 3 million people like this. You have the feeling you're in the country, actually.
If you have a small garden, don't let yourself be discouraged by visiting larger, grander gardens with lots of features. Look at it the other way around. Try to gain something, some idea from that big garden, and then adapt it on a smaller scale to your own. Many of the mistakes we make are just having too many different ideas. One of the many compartments in Helen Dillon's town garden in Dublin is a small, secret, hidden area, a central dolphin fountain makes a focal point, and the constant drip of water creates a cool, refreshing atmosphere. Lady's mantle and ferns grow and seed in the paving, giving a casual look. The design is simple. At ground level, a pattern of box, gravel and stone walks is softened by flowers and foliage. Helen adds further interest by using clipped box domes at the corners, but her overall scheme of green keeps the design restful rather than fussy. At Bosvigo, Wendy Perry has a cobbled courtyard outside the back of the house. It is surrounded by tall walls, and she limits planting themes and design ideas to keep the restrained mood.
This is my kitchen courtyard at Bosvigo, with walls on all sides. A small space, you might find it in any urban city. Not much space to plant, so I've built a planter with bricks and used vines, clematis, the wonderful golden hop, to try to conceal and enhance, really, these vertical walls. And to link the area together, not using too much colour, just keeping it to whites and soft greys, and put cobbles on the floor to make a pattern to lead into the next courtyard. I'm trying to create a series of small rooms, of personal spaces. Not too much colour. It should be soft and gentle and peaceful. Something I can come out and stroll in the evening. Something that's very personal to me. I think it's something that perhaps anybody who lives in a city can do. They can take these small spaces and plant them for harmony and quiet.
In 1991, I designed the new herb garden at the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. It is large for a modern herb garden, but being only 90 foot by 30 foot, it is really still a small garden space. It has all the elements of a small contained garden, with simplicity and purity of design, and by definition, as all the plants must be useful, a limited plant palette. The central pattern is based on European 16th and 17th century designs, when ornamental knots were planted up with traditional, medicinal and culinary herbs. These herbs were brought to America with the first settlers. But in this modern herb garden, indigenous American plants used for centuries before European contact by Native Americans are woven into the overall pattern, which has a distinctly decorative look. The interlacing box pattern allows visitors to walk through its centre, its lines of box interrupted by gravel beds alternating with summer annuals. Most of the plants in the outer border have aromatic foliage and thrive in heat, and visitors can sit on benches and actually feel almost surrounded by fragrance and colour, with the seats set back so that they can even touch the foliage nearby. Grey-leaved ornamental pear trees are placed on the corners to give vertical height and to make the garden into a secret space. The garden lies just below the famed Enid Haupt Conservatory and next to the perennial gardens. Two pathways carry the eye from the herb garden into the colourful perennial borders designed by Lyndon Miller, and plants such as catmint link the two distinct garden areas together. If you have a small space, it's really good to experiment with it. This is a new garden compartment out in my meadow, and I never really meant to do it at all, but in the end I couldn't resist making a new area. At this year it's all reds and oranges and yellows, but actually the foundation planting is a white rugosa hedge and white rugosa roses all along the borders. This is only their second year, so they're not very tall yet. And I was really happy that a lot of these plants are self-seeding plants, so we brought some of the earth from the other garden where I knew there'd be seed of this red orac, the atriplex, and then we sowed nasturtiums which go up the metal tripods, and you can see that red poppies have come up. I bought some dark red nasturtiums as well and put in a few red dahlias just to make the colour have a little bit more zing about it. I love to do repetition, and you can see that even here with the seedlings, which of course one edits, I like the repetitions of these big clumps of the dark purple foliage and the reds and oranges. So the general principles of a small garden are really to be seen here. I have used repetition in planting, which I think is important. I've used big things in small spaces, big foliage and quite tall in a small space. And a garden, however small, you want to be in it and sit in it, not only just visit. And that's why I have a sitting area right up at the top where I'm pollarding plane trees, what you call sycamore trees, to make a lovely shady place to sit in the evening. And of course here the evening light is most beautiful because the reds and yellows really glow after 6 o'clock when the shadows are long, and that's when I love to come. So don't be afraid if you have a small space to experiment, and even think of experimenting and having a completely different garden every year. This one is certainly going to be different. I'm not even quite sure what it will look like, but I'm sure it will give me pleasure again. Goodbye.